If you grew up in West Africa, this will look completely ordinary. A bowl of red palm oil. People had cooked with it, lit their home with it, and used it as medicine long before Europeans developed any serious interest in it. But during the 19th century, this familiar oil became one of the most valuable products on the West African coast. It traveled from farm to villages around the Niger Delta into the British factories, railway workshops, and family homes. And it was meant to help end slavery. But instead, in many places, it helped slavery even grow more. So, how did a trade promoted as a moral alternative to selling human beings suddenly create a new demand for enslaved labor? And how did palm oil begin pulling Britain from trade on the coast towards political control of the land? At the end of the last episode, Britain had outlawed the Atlantic slave trade and sent the Royal Navy to suppress it. Abolitionists believed that stopping the exports of enslaved people was only the first step. The coast needed another kind of economy. They called the answer legitimate commerce. The phrase meant trade in goods rather than trade in people. The hope was simple. If African merchants and rulers could earn more from produce, then the slave trade would lose its attraction and gradually disappear. It sounded reasonable. The problem was that changing what Britain bought did not automatically change who did the work. The oil palm grew widely across the forest of the Niger Delta and countries behind it. Local communities already understood every part of its value. Then, industrial Britain discovered that the same thick red oil could solve several practical problems at once. It greased factory machinery. It lubricated railway axles. It made candles that burned brightly and cleanly. Most importantly, it made soap. A chemical breakthrough in the 1820s made large-scale soap production possible, just as Britain's towns were growing and more people afford manufactured goods. That created an enormous appetite for oil. The growth was extraordinary. Around the time Britain abolished the slave trade, West Africa was sending Britain a little more than 100 tons of palm oil in a year. By the early 1850s, that figure had risen to more than 30,000 tons. Liverpool had once grown rich as Britain's great slave trading port. Now, many of its firms turned to palm oil. The ships changed their cargo, the merchants changed their language, and the Delta acquired a new European name, the Oil Rivers. Even now, most European traders did not settle far inland. The seas still made the coast deadly for them, and the story of the white man's grave had not suddenly ended. Many lived aboard old sailing ships anchored in the creeks. These hulks became floating homes, warehouses, and trading stations. African canoes brought oil out of them. The oil was measured, stored, and exchanged for imported goods. And some of those imports revealed an uncomfortable truth about this supposedly peaceful commerce. European traders still supplied guns and gunpowder. In 1842, one trading captain carried 50 tons of gunpowder, 1,000 muskets, and 1,600 pieces of cloth to burning. He left with 480 tons of palm oil. So the trade had changed, but weapons continued to flow into the same coast. In Britain, manufacturers could present palm products as part of the campaign against slavery. Some candles were sold with the idea that buying them supported legitimate commerce. In 1853, Chancellor William Gladstone cut the tax on soap partly in the name of that same cause. But between a candle in Liverpool and a cask of oil in the Niger Delta stood an African trading system that Europeans did not control. Not yet. The palm oil trade on the African side belongs to powerful merchants of the Delta. The states that had once organized the coastal slave trade adapted their commercial machinery to oil. Their house system gathered labor, credits, canoe, and trading connections under influential leaders. The head of the greatest houses became merchant princes. They stood between the producers in land and Europeans waiting on the water. That position gave them power. A European captain could simply walk into the interior, find the farmers and buy directly. He depended on African brokers who knew the waterways, controlled the canoes, maintained inland networks, and negotiated with local communities. William Dapper Pepple, king of the bonnet through the middle decades of the 19th century, was one ruler who could balance the demand of British traders against the interests of his own states. Men like him were not minor assistants in European business. They controlled the commercial middle grounds on which the business depended. The system worked through customs that could confuse an outsider. A ship captain usually did not pay cash and lived with oil. He advanced imported goods to an African broker on credit. The broker then repaid that debt with palm oil over the trading season. The arrangement was called trust. Before trading began, the ship also paid a duty to the local king. That payment was called come. Clothes, metal, spirits, guns, and other goods could change hands on the strength of a merchant's promise. When that promise was broken, the dispute might stop trade across an entire river or lead to raids and retaliation. To manage such quarrels, Africans and European traders created joint bodies known as the Courts of Equity. These were not modern courts in the way we might imagine them. They were practical attempts to keep a difficult commercial system working. Credits, local authorities, and personal reputation matters as much as written law. And through all of it, African traders remain essential. The point matters because later British accounts often make imperial expansion sound as if Europeans arrived to organize a trade that barely existed. The trade was already organized. Africans had built it, adapted it, and profited from it. British merchants wanted a large share and increasingly wanted to remove the middlemen who stood in their way. The house system also allowed an unusual kind of social movement. A man with ability could rise inside a trading house even if he had begun life enslaved. Some men who had once been enslaved eventually commanded fleets of canoe and large fortune in oil. That did not make the system equal or humane, but it shows that African commercial society was more complex than a simple division between kings at the top and powerless laborers beneath them. Now, we reach the contradiction at the center of this episode. Palm oil did not process itself. The fruits had to be gathered, boiled and pounded and pressed. Then the heavy oil had to be carried, sometimes for days, in pots balanced on woman's head until it reached the waterside. This was slow, exhausting work, and as British demand increased, the need for labor increased with it. In many areas, enslaved people supplied that labor. Captives who might once have been sold across the Atlantic were now kept within West Africa and made to work on farms, in households, and along trading routes. Ending the export trade did not necessarily free them, it merely redirected them. Across the decades, when Britain celebrated abolition, slavery within West Africa expanded. Women and enslaved people carried much of the burden of producing the oil that leads and cleaned home in industrial Britain. There is no neat way to soften that contradiction. Some of the soap presented as part of the struggle against slavery was made from oil produced by enslaved labor. The distance between producers and consumers helped hide the system. A family buying soap in Britain saw a finished product associated with cleanliness and respectable commerce. They did not see the women boiling fruits, the enslaved workers pounding it, or the long journey carrying oil to the river. The moral label belonged to the commodity at the point of sale. The labor conditions remained far away. That distance allowed abolition and exploitation to exist inside the same commercial chain. Historians still debate how this economic change affected West African societies. The economic historian A.G. Hopkins described a crisis of adaptation. His argument was that the slave trade had largely belonged to powerful rulers and wealthy merchants because capturing, guarding, and moving people require force and capital. Palm oil could be produced by smaller farmers and carried by smaller traders. That spread commercial opportunity more widely and weakened some older elites. Then, when palm oil prices later declined, rulers who had lost income faced a deeper political crisis. So, in this reading, economic disruptions helped create the instability that Europeans later exploited. It is a strong argument, but it did not fit every place equally well. Other historians, including Martin Lane, have shown that many other elites adapted successfully. Delta Merchant House did not simply collapse. The Arrow network in the interior continued to exercise influence. Paul Lovejoy and David Richardson found that abolition hurt coastal elites at first, but trade recovered within roughly a decade, and for a period even the export of enslaved people revived. And in the far north, where important commerce moved across the Sahara rather than towards the Atlantic coast, these changes could feel much more distant. So, there was no single West African experience. In some regions, palm oil opened opportunity to new producers and weakened other powers. In others, the established elite mastered the new trade and became stronger. The consequences changed from one community to another. What did not change was the directions of Britain's relationship with the coast. It was becoming closer, and that closeness carried danger. The Atlantic slave trade had allowed Europeans to wait at the shore for captives to be brought to them. The oil trade demanded a steadier flow of produce, predictable prices, and access to producers deeper inland. If a Delta broker demanded a price a British merchant disliked, or conflict in the interior interrupted the flow of oil, Britain firms increasingly asked their governments to intervene. The pattern often began with a consul. Then came a treaty, and when agreement failed, a gunboat might appear. Each intervention could be described as the protection of honest trade. Yet, step by step, the line between commercial influence and political control began to disappear. Palm oil was supposed to replace the trade in human beings. It did help transform the economy of the coast. It created African fortunes connected to the Niger Delta more closely to industrial Britain and gave legal commerce a new center of gravity. But it also expanded the demand for enslaved labor in many places. It carried more guns into the region, and it made Britain merchants far less willing to remain at the water's edge. Then, another problem arrived. Britain was not the only European power looking at West Africa. France was moving. Germany was about to make a move, and once European governments began to fear that a rival might take the market they wanted, trade was no longer enough. They began to want the land itself. And in the next episode, we will follow the change that turned centuries of coastal bargaining into a race for an entire continent. For now, think deeply about this episode, and I will see you in the next one.